The evacuation of Afghans is proceeding at pace, with 16,000 people going in the past 24 hours. Not surprising, since a deadline looms. Foreign forces are meant to be out of the country by a week tomorrow. Thousands, however, are still outside the gates, and the British would like more time.
Well, I think it says something about the state of transatlantic relations at the moment. Normally, the Brits would have gone in quietly in Washington and put their case direct to the White House. Now we seem to be pleading through the media, and we're not having any more traction than any other US ally. I think this shows that the Americans are completely focused on their narrow national need to get their citizens out, and really aren't listening, I don't think, to other allies at all.
On the ground, US-UK cooperation is, as usual, close. But this crisis has exposed uncertainties at the political level, with the White House initially making its decisions with little consultation with allies. Tonight they insisted that was different now, but that the president hadn't yet decided to heed British pleas for a longer evacuation mission.
The president has spoken twice now with the British Prime Minister. He has spoken with the German Chancellor, the French President, the Spanish President, the Italian Prime Minister, the Emir of Qatar, and the Crown Prince of the UAE. Tomorrow, he will participate in a G7 leaders meeting on Afghanistan to ensure the world's leading democracies are aligned and united on the way forward.
So the US will leave until the last minute any decision on whether to extend the airlift beyond the end of this month. People in the UK government don't seem to know which way they'll go, but one thing is clear: any extension would have to involve some sort of accommodation with the Taliban. And for their part, the Taliban leadership say the deadline is not negotiable.
If they extend behind 31st August, that is a clear violation, one thing. Secondly, about consequences, it is up to our leadership how to proceed and what kind of decision they take. That decision will be implemented.
Of course, the US might argue that an extension of a week or two shouldn't matter, given the Taliban's own violation of the Doha peace accords. But President Biden will be reluctant to change course.
80% of Americans want us to do the right thing by Afghans and the Afghans who've been bravely fighting this conflict on our behalf as well as their behalf, and for those who are seeking safety and who won't be safe in Afghanistan with the Taliban in control of the country. So the president's policy is so deeply cynical, banking on us not caring what happens. And I hope that won't prove true. And I think early polling suggests that this disgraceful run for the exits is and should be politically costly.
So with UK ministers apparently resigned to thousands of eligible Afghans being left behind, the emphasis may shift to getting them out via Pakistan or Central Asian neighbours. But many in Whitehall will feel a lesson has been learned.
I think this crisis has been a brutal wake-up call to those who felt that after Brexit, Britain's special link to Washington and our independence in the world would enable us to operate as one of the major countries shaping the international order of the future, as the government put it. In fact, the Americans have been operating largely for domestic reasons and largely without consulting their allies. I think we do need to go back and look at the government's foreign policy, which has been based on delusion for recent years, and think more carefully about Britain's interests, how we pursue them as a middle-sized, if still influential country.
The airlift continues then, and it's moving large numbers. President Biden, though, will soon have to decide whether the risks of extending that mission are justified.
Mark Urban. Well, earlier I spoke to Munera Yousufzada, Afghanistan's former Deputy Defence Minister. I started by asking her whether President Biden should extend the evacuation deadline.
I think the US departure date should be postponed, as there are a lot of Afghans who are distressed and feel unsafe due to the Taliban takeover. The request of the people of Afghanistan is that this departure date is postponed.
I want to ask you something as the former Deputy Defence Minister. Joseph Biden said the Afghan army was better equipped, better trained and more numerous than the Taliban. So why was there such a sudden collapse?
During a conflict, good training and equipment does not always lead to victory. Good leadership is what is more important. Good leadership means a strong president, ministers and commanders. The lack of that meant that we were not able to utilize our armed forces to the best of their abilities.
Joe Biden claimed that the Afghan army had 300,000 soldiers. Our BBC programme Newsnight did some research and found that the figure was nearer 50,000. What do you think the figure was?
It's not 300,000. All Afghan forces could be 300,000, but I was in charge of our army. And we have recorded the number to be 180,000. The accurate number is 180,000. But there were ghost forces that we were trying to identify.
That's really interesting. Thank you very much for that. I also want to ask you about corruption, because corruption in the Afghan army was legendary. Why was that allowed to happen, and who allowed it to happen?
There is no denying of corruption in Afghanistan, especially within the army. There is no doubt that corruption is one of the biggest reasons of our failure in this war, and unfortunately, despite our many efforts to tackle it, there was an active group within the Defence Ministry who solely wanted to serve their own interest. Despite all of that, especially in the last year, Asadullah Khaled, the Defence Minister, tried his best to tackle this and was successful in doing so.
But Afghan soldiers also went for months without pay. I wonder how soldiers can be expected to fight without pay.
از زمانی که سیستم ابس که کار مشترک میرم آرس جور کرده بود یک سیستم منابع بشری و پرداخت.
Since the ABS payroll system was introduced, we ensured that all soldiers were paid on time if they had their biometric details registered and they were on the payroll. However, in some parts of the country with no banks, especially in provinces that were at risk, we did struggle with that, but it was very rare. We did try our best to pay soldiers in cash in those provinces, but unfortunately, due to the lack of security, this issue existed in select few parts of the country, but the numbers were low.
As you say, there was corruption, and you say that you did your best to tackle it. You were in government for 5 years, the last year of which was Deputy Defence Minister. But do you think that you, as a politician, did enough to tackle corruption?
مبارزه با فساد چیزی نبود که من یک نفر یا دو نفر بتونه مبارزه بکنه. متاسفانه
Fighting against corruption is not something I or a few others could do alone. Unfortunately, those responsible were never prosecuted or held responsible. Perpetrators who reached the criminal justice system were let free after some time. I can speak for times when Asadullah Khaled was in charge. Him, Yasin Zia and I tried our best to fight against corruption. But unfortunately, corruption was so deeply rooted that fighting against it needed a longer-term strategy and not something we could abolish in 2 years alone. We were also not supported to do so.
What do you think will happen if the 31st deadline is the one that Joe Biden insists on?
طالبان هیچ تغییر نکردن. اونها حتی
The Taliban have not changed. In fact, they hold even more grudges. They will start to seek revenge and will continue to police women even more. The sacrifices of the international community and Afghan people will all be lost.
دولت افغانستان و ملت افغانستان از زیر پا میشه.
So, what is the future prospects for the country? Do you feel this is a nation being left to its fate, and particularly women and girls?
افغانستان روزای بسیار بدی را داره.
Afghanistan awaits bad days in the future. Under the Taliban rule and their restriction, the worst is waiting for us. At the same time, there are resistant groups fighting against the Taliban, formed in parts of the country, which open gates for another war against the Taliban. In this war, the people who will suffer the most are women and children.
Munera Yousufzada, thank you very much for joining us. Well, I'm joined now by Lord Darroch, former British ambassador to the US and national security advisor, and Hugo Llorens, a former US ambassador to Afghanistan. Good evening to you both. If I can begin with you, Hugo Llorens. Tonight, softening the conversation between the US and the UK, agreeing to this joint operation after the end of the initial phase. Does that sound like there will be movement on the 31st of August deadline when the G7 meets tomorrow?
Well, Kirsty, again, great to be with you. You know, the first thing I would just say is we wouldn't be having this conversation if it wasn't a decision made by President Biden on April the 14th to precipitously withdraw US forces and by extension, NATO forces. So the consequences of that have been horrible. It's resulted in a humanitarian tragedy in Afghanistan, the collapse of a pro-Western government in Kabul, the Taliban seizing power, it's something that will have security and geopolitical consequences. So I think as President Biden goes into this G7 meeting, we're dealing with the immediate crisis of getting our citizens out, the citizens of the coalition members, and also those Afghans who worked for us, who worked for our military, worked for our diplomatic missions. And I think it's very important for President Biden, under the current circumstances where the trust of the alliance has been undermined, that he send a message that he really is listening. I hope that this idea of an August 31 deadline is not a political timeline, that we really focus on working within the G7 and all the partners in getting our people out. And if it requires going beyond August 31, that's what it should be.
Now,
I hope he listens.
Kim Darroch, I don't think I've ever seen before British government ministers going on television and radio as if to speak directly to the US government to say, delay the 31st of August deadline. I mean, is there an air of desperation about the British approach?
There is a bit, Kirsty. I mean, normally the approach would be National Security Advisor, phone call to National Security Advisor, Prime Minister, phone call to President, the Foreign Secretary talking to Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, and private discussions, hopefully, leading to what we think is the right conclusion. So it's pretty extraordinary to have ministers out on the airwaves like this. And
do you think that Boris Johnson holds any bargaining chips for the delay?
I think there is a chance. I think it's a small chance. I think he has to show empathy, because I think it'd be a very difficult decision for President Biden now to extend. And then, of course, you have the question of whether Taliban would agree to it. I think he needs to show unity with his European colleagues who will be also as part of this virtual call, the French, the Germans, the Italians, all of whom have people at Kabul airport. And he needs to persuade the president to do the right thing, which is to stay a bit longer and get more people out, because these are people who risk their lives for us.
Hugo Llorens, the Pentagon spokesman tonight was kind of very laissez-faire about the idea that the Taliban are threatening a red line if indeed the coalition does not move out on the 31st. Do you think the US is genuinely fearful of a Taliban major attack? I suppose it could only need to be in order to stop operations, a few mortar bombs on the runway.
Yeah, you're in a very risky situation. The Taliban, in a sense, are calling the shots. Mm-hmm. But again, I agreed with Lord Darroch that, I think the president doesn't have that much margin for maneuver. I mean, I'm sure that the prime minister has been consulting with the other G7 leaders, and the president has to show the others that he's in a listening mode. Now, whether how much longer we stay, whether we agree to stay several more days, a week, 2 weeks, I hope it's driven by conditions on the ground and not a timetable. But I think there's a fair chance that the president will be willing to move that timetable. But certainly, we're talking to the Taliban, and I know we're doing it right now.
Yeah, but in fact, the room for negotiation was way back, wasn't it? And I wonder, both of you were in position when Donald Trump was trying to make this deal with the Taliban. Should he have made a tougher deal? And should you all have been saying, you've got a real problem down the line here, you have to make a tougher deal with the Taliban?
I don't think it was a great deal with the Taliban. Yeah. The Afghan government weren't in the room for it.
Which was a mistake.
And there were very general, rather weak conditions set on the Taliban keeping terrorists out of the country. But it's significant, Kirsty, that none of the Europeans, I think, tried to contest the deal at the time, and nor did they contest it when President Biden announced that he was still going to go ahead with withdrawal on a later date. So all of us have our fingerprints over this.
So tell me, what signal was sent by Ben Wallace today, do you think? It was up at Fort George near Inverness talking to the Black Watch and talking about deploying the Black Watch behind the forces that are already in. Is that, as it were, in readiness for some kind of Taliban attack?
You'd hope not. You'd very much hope not, because that would be highly risky. I don't think we know necessarily how many Taliban fighters there are in Kabul.
Or indeed if they're Taliban.
And the last thing anyone wants, surely, in the last days of our presence in Afghanistan, is more deaths, more casualties. America's had more than 6,000, we've had more than 450. And
many woundings as well.
And many woundings.
Hugo Llorens, I mean, the talk of the inclusive government yesterday it was the Taliban talking of the inclusive government. Today it was the UK government and some of the resistance in Afghanistan. It's a kind of ultimate kick in the teeth, isn't it, for all those families of servicemen and women who lost their lives, and of the thousands more wounded and who have TSD and other ailments, that this is happening now?
Look, I think that, when I was ambassador in 2017, what we were able to do is create a military, diplomatic, economic development, and intelligence model that was very small, and it was, in our view, was sustainable from a blood and treasure perspective. So, and I think we had that, and we rolled it out. Lord Darroch was ambassador at that time in Washington. We rolled it out in August of 2017, and that was a model that was very sustainable and effective. Very small US NATO presence, 8,500 US troops, some NATO, a small air contingent, very effective. The Afghans totally in the lead. They were doing 95% of the fighting, 99% of the dying. Fortunately, with the removal of some of the key players in President Trump's national security team, the president politicized the issue and eventually negotiated this agreement on February 29, 2020, which in my 40 years of diplomacy, I would say it's the worst diplomatic agreement.
So in the final seconds
ever negotiated.
In the final seconds we have, just in terms of the geopolitical impact on this, essentially, America has ceded power and left Russia and China, in the backyard of Russia and China, is now left to them, not the Americans.
Yes, I mean, I think it's been a defeat for the United States, and it's been a defeat for its allies, with our allies together. And we're going to have to work very hard to dig ourselves out of the hole we're in. And Afghanistan could be ungoverned space. It could put us in a pre-September 11 situation all over again after 20 years of sacrifice, and it will have geopolitical consequences, no doubt about it.
Are you very briefly, Kim Darroch, are you as pessimistic as that?
I am. I think this is a huge defeat for the West, not just for America and Britain, and we'll be dealing with the repercussions of it for years to come.
Thank you both very much for joining us tonight.